It was often said that we are known as the invisible Dutch Australians. A wave of us hit the shores in the 1950s and 60s. Now our stories are being told. Right here in the Dutch Australian Cultural Centre, we have quite a few of the books that have been written about the experience of coming to Australia, whether it was in 1600 or whether it was after World War II. The Dutch Australian Cultural Centre has now existed, at least under two names. First the Dutch Australian Centre, now the Dutch Australian Cultural Centre, since the very beginning of the 1980s. Right now we're in desperate need of someone to come along and join the board and to take on the role of honorary treasurer. It was often said that we are known as the invisible Dutch Australians. A wave of us hit the shores in the 1950s and 60s. Now our stories are being told. Right here in the Dutch Australian Cultural Centre, we have quite a few of the books that have been written about the experience of coming to Australia, whether it was in 1600 or whether it was after World War II. We're at 85 Market Street, Smithfield, and we can be found here particularly on Wednesdays, Fridays and Sundays when the shop is open. A number of stories have now been written about our experiences and about the connection between Australia and the Netherlands. I came here with my parents when I was 12 years old on what is known as the wave. There were a lot of us then, and with no idea really what we were coming to. There are some other stories. My story hasn't been written yet. For example, let's pretend we're in the book club on Channel 2 on the ABC, and let's discuss this particular book. All Australians Now. This man's arrival here in Australia was so similar to mine, except that he stayed on that side of Australia. My parents and I were told that we might have better chances if we went to the eastern seaboard, and this is where we ended up. The lady who wrote this book, she particularly inspired me to perhaps one day write my own story. Her name is Yvonne Louis, and she wrote this book. This was her second major book. I'm not sure if she wrote or published any before that. And this is called A Brush with Mondrian, and it tells her story of her life in Australia and later her search through Europe for her background, and it's linked to this particular painting, and that's why it's called A Brush with Mondrian. Come and have a look at it here in the Dutch Australian Cultural Centre.
And I had no Dutch connections, because my father was of the opinion that once we'd made this major move across the world, that we were going to speak English and our Dutch background was to be forgotten. It was the assimilate or perish years that we came. We did have the odd friend who's... The journey back through A Brush with Mondrian has been not only a connection of finding the history of the paintings, but reconnecting with my half-siblings. One brother and sister when I was in my 40s, and the other brother when I was 21, but he'd not been speaking to the others for 25 years, so that took another 25 years to come good. But my reconnection with my Dutchness, part of that as well.
Here on the bookshelf in the Dutch Australian Cultural Centre, amongst the other books written by Dutch Australian authors or authors of Dutch background or with a Dutch connection, is a book called Anna's War. I would like to show you an interview I had with the author of this book, Joanna van Rooij, right here in this Dutch Australian Cultural Centre behind the Dutch shop in Smithfield.
Just the story of Mum's brother dying when the Americans accidentally bombed Nijmegen always just stayed with me, and I actually wrote a very small story about it when I was doing my course, and I just wanted to expand on that, and then it just sort of grew. Using all the lots of little stories that they told us. I had the story of my mum's brother, Franciscus, and then I just sort of worked more on that and worked on the diary idea, using this girl, I suppose using the profile of my mother as the person who this girl would be, and then checking all my historical facts, and it's amazing what you can find on the internet. Oh look, I found the prayer and dedication for my mum's brother that's at the Groesberg graveyard in Nijmegen, for a lot of the victims, and it's just fascinating.
The latest book to arrive here at the Dutch Australian Culture Centre at 85 Market Street, Smithfield, is this one. I'm not going to pronounce its title. It's pretty well known that I can't say those kind of words either in Dutch or in English. But come along to 85 Market Street, Smithfield, and have a look yourself. We're here on Wednesdays, Fridays and Sundays. So my memories of coming here as a 12-year-old boy and seeing my parents meet up with other fellow Dutch Australians was that so often the stories turned to the war, which of course was one of the reasons that my father, amongst so many, gave for wanting to migrate to Australia, because when we came here in 1956 there was much talk of a Third World War. I love this little book. I so often mention it. Put together by Eeften Brummelaar when the Dutch Australian Centre, as it was then called, was still in its very early days. Just a little booklet with samples of the experiences of the Dutch in Australia in the early years. Men do not immigrate in despair, but in hope, said Sir William Hancock. It is clear and proved in the course of time that enormous disappointments, setbacks and tensions can occur during the assimilation progress. It is especially in the latter difficult area that the churches fulfill a task which is invaluable for many migrants. The Australian Information Service had a slogan, "Select Australia for you and your children." This sentence induced many to think and dream. One could go for the betterment of the children, and that sounded like a noble thought, which is more acceptable than, "I would like to be my boss for a change." Ooh, that one is actually quite close to the bone. First visit to the Netherlands. The first days are fantastic. No end to the discussions with old friends and relations. The concept Australia is vague for most of them, and they treasure their idea that it is a faraway place and backward in development compared to Europe. Soon you're thinking, maybe it would be difficult to settle back in the Dutch way of life in Holland. It all seems so much more complicated than it is here. Life in Australia is good, even if we probably idealize it. That's also from the Sprong, page 14. I've just picked this up from the shelf here at the Dutch Australian Cultural Centre. Dick's theme in life was and is, if it is not there, make it. What a positive approach to life. What an opening to life's treasures. What a role model. Dick van Leer, a young man even in his late 80s, full of love, joy and gratefulness.